Okay, now we're going to work with the idea of heredity. And Gregor Mendel started this a lot of the work in the mid 1800s and really advanced the idea of genes, although he called them factors, and how they get passed down from one plant to the next. He was a monk that lived in Austria, studied math and science at university, and then he applied his knowledge to the study of the inheritance of traits in pea plants. And he looked at 7 different traits. He looked at height and seed shape, seed color, seed coat color, pod shape, pod color, and flower position. These weren't on different kinds of plants. These were all on pea plants. And he would cross one type with another and see what the offspring looked like and how that compared back to the parents. And he did this over and over and over again with somewhere around 29,000 different plants. And so he had a lot of math, a lot of numbers going in here. I was taking a lot of data. One of the things that he was working with was the idea of true breeding. And this is a plant that always produces offspring with the same trait it has when pollinated with itself. So if I take something that's dominant for, let's say, a seed color, and I cross it with another one, either with itself or another one just like it, a true breeding plant will always produce the offspring looking just like the parent. So cross with itself or cross with an identical one, true breeding produces the offspring with the same as the parent. The same thing with a recessive version of the gene. Okay, so recessive cross with itself or with another recessive gives offspring that look just like the parent, always. True breeding always produces offspring with the same trait as the parent has. Notice these have to be homozygous, okay, dominant, or recessive. So what Mendel does is he takes a true breeding for tall and a true breeding for short, and he crosses them. And he says, all right, now let's see what I get. And he notices that when he crosses it, what he gets are tall plants. He doesn't get some tall, some short. He doesn't get middle height. He gets tall plants. They both look like this one. Okay, this is the F1 generation, the first generation, all tall. So this is that F1 generation, the first cross. Then he crosses these with each other, and you notice that when they come across, although he couldn't see this at the time, dominant recessive. If you cross these with each other or with themselves, same thing, then the next generation comes out a little bit different. You come out with 3 that are tall and 1 that's short. And if we look at the genotype or the genes within this, we would see dominant, giving us the tall, dominant recessive, and another dominant recessive, giving us talls, and recessive, giving us that short. Okay, and this experiment led to the ideas of dominant and recessive genes, and not a mixing of genes, is what was said beforehand. So, true breeding, you get tall, but they're no longer true breeding. Now when you cross them with each other, you get 3 talls and a short. And if we look at their genes, we would see dominant recessive, and recessive. So what I want is a diagram that shows one true breeding regular height crossed with one true breeding dwarf and what the offspring would look like, and include the alleles of the genes and draw what happens. So a diagram that shows one true breeding regular. So if it's true breeding, you know it's got to be homozygous, so it's going to have 2 of the same genes, and we're going to cross with a true breeding dwarf, and that was the recessive gene. Okay, and so if we cross this and we look at it, see, well, I can have this one and this one. I can have that one again and this one. I can have this one and this one. And I can have that one again and this one. So those are my 4 possibilities if I cross this with this. Okay, and I've shown all the different alleles. And what would they look like? Dominant recessive, dominant recessive, dominant recessive, dominant recessive. So I would have 4 tall plants. So something like that. Okay. Now these alleles interact to produce traits. Okay. And we have a couple new terms, ones we've been working with in class with the dragons, but we have phenotypes. These are characteristics that are actually on the organism. The color eyes they have, the height they are, looking inside the heart. This is, it's not just the stuff on the outside, it's how the inside works. But the phenotype are what actually shows up. The genotype, these are the alleles that the organism actually has. So genotype codes for phenotype. The phenotype is based on the genes that you have. So you have genes on your DNA, and these codes for the phenotype. Okay? But you also need to realize that not all the genes show up. Some of them are silent. So for example, if we look over here about genotype and phenotype, we can see this purple flower. The genotype could be dominant-dominant, in which case this is saying the organism has 2 genes for the dominant color for making purple flowers. But it could also be dominant recessive. So this one codes for purple. This one codes for white, but it's a recessive gene, and in this case the dominant one tells it to be quiet. Okay, and so that's a recessive gene. And it doesn't speak up. So this purple flower could have a gene for white in it, and it just doesn't end up showing up. The white flower, the genotype, is a recessive, lowercase, recessive. So it has 2 genes for making a white flower. Okay, so genotype and phenotype. Phenotype is what we actually see. Genotype is what's on the genes, not all of which may end up being expressed. And then we get to humans and all the traits that you ask and wonder about. And you got to remember that most of these are coded for by multiple genes. And if we just even look at eye colors, there's all kinds of different eye colors. And that's because there's a whole bunch of genes involved. You can have codominance. You can have mixtures of things in between. So you got to be careful. It usually isn't quite as cut and dried as looking at this. And then in class we dealt a lot with dominant alleles and recessive alleles. Dominant allele is the one that shows up even if only one is present. It silences the other one. And recessive allele is expressed only if it is the only allele present. So this recessive, you get the white flower. But if there's a dominant one there, it doesn't. In most cases, there's always the exceptions. So now I wanted is a map to show the difference between genotype and phenotype. Use it and so you can come over here. You can do something similar to the diagram that I had back here. You can do something like that. Okay, you can use dragons or you can use the P traits and show. You can have this. I'm not going to write the whole thing out. You can have this genotype. We'll make this phenotype. This is what's on the genes. This is how you look. I also want a diagram to show how dominant and recessive alleles work. And so you can show me about, well, if I have dominant, what ends up being made? If I have dominant, recessive, what do you get? If I have recessive, what do you get? And you can come up with a trait and assign one dominant and one recessive and show me the possible combinations. Okay, so we're looking at heredity and how the genes get passed on from the adult to the offspring, from the parent to the offspring.